welcome on behalf of the Scientific and Technical Committee of the Bigiavi Library of Economics, and also, of course, on behalf of the University of Bologna as a whole, our distinguished visitor and guest, Professor Sunanda Sen. Let me say just a few words about Professor Sunanda Sen. Sunanda Sen has been for many years Professor of Economics at Nehru University of Delhi. She has been a National Fellow of the Indian Council of Social Sciences, also at Delhi, and some years ago in Cambridge University was the recipient of the Joan Robinson Memorial Lectureship established in that university. She has also another important connection with the University of Cambridge because she was in the past visiting fellow of Clare Hall, of which she is now a life member. She also has many connections with several universities across the world, such as the Levy Economics Institute at Bard College, United States of America. Her research interests cover a wide area, including economic development, economic history, and international political economy and gender studies. Her publication output is enormous. It stretches back many decades, of course, and I would like just to mention the most recent ones, such as Colonies and Empire, 1992, Global Finance at Risk, 2003, Globalisation and Development, a book I know very well actually, published by the National Book Trust of India in Delhi. Then Unfreedom and Wage Work, Labor in India's Manufacturing Industry, Development on Trial, Dominant Finance and Stagnant Economies, Oxford University Press, 2014. Most recently, also this book, which I hold in my hands, The Changing Face of Imperialism, Colonies to Contemporary Capitalism, published, very freshly published by Routledge, 2018. Let me just a few words actually, also about the fact that I think Sunanda Sen, Professor Sunanda Sen, is one of the prototypical representatives of a very distinguished strands of economic research in India, which in a way has been a characterizing feature of economic culture in India and worldwide in the decades, I think, since the 1950s, 1960s actually. And I would like to mention a few other Indian economists whom I think have been in a way or another closely associated with Professor Sunanda Sen, and whom actually I had the great luck to discuss with and to meet. Economists such as Krishna Bharadwaj, Sukhamoy Chakravarti, Amit Baduri, Amya Kumar Bachi. So, just continuing this tradition of interaction, Professor Sunanda Sen is now spending a relatively long period visiting Italy, because Professor Sunanda Sen has many contacts with Indian economists, with Italian economists. There is actually an important tradition of connectivity, I would say, between Indian economists and Italian economists, stretching back various decades. And it is, I think, our special privilege to have Sunanda Sen visiting the University of Bologna in the Economics Library here today. Professor Sen's talk will be on the paradox of poverty under high growth in India. So, welcome once again, and you have the floor now. Thanks.
Thank you so much for wonderful introduction, which I don't think they deserve that much. And so, as mentioned, the topic is this paradox of poverty in high growth India. This is, in other words, the title itself sort of rejects the theme that with growth there is a trickle down. With growth there should be, it will make everybody happy and so. Yeah. Can I request Leonardo? Can I get a little water? Maybe I.
Yes. Yes. Sure.
If it's possible. Yeah. If it's possible.
Yeah.
So then, thank you. The thing is that, this trickle down, that meat, what is it? It says that, after all, if there is growth, in absence of growth, nothing much can happen. In absence of growth, nothing much happens, and therefore growth is very desirable, and not only desirable, it is the ultimate solution to a country's problems, including whatever, including, of course, it should include poverty, and therefore there will be a trickle down. We all know this standard argument that trickle down has to happen over time. If it doesn't happen tomorrow, well, a few years, let it be, and that's it. Well, I think it's time that we disagree with such kind of statements or with such notions, because it has been proved that growth has not led to this kind of trickle down, or what one should say, development. Where is development even when there is growth? So this is how I view it, and this typically relates to India. Therefore, I have put India in the title also. It also relates to other countries. It is a standard theorem. It is a standard argument that in absence of growth, nothing will happen. Therefore, emphasis should be on growth. But with growth, what happens? This is our question. Does it lead to quote-unquote development? Is development different from a country's growth? And if development doesn't happen, then what remains? How do you solve the problems? How do you bring human development? People's state sort of improvement. Okay. So the first thing, we start with this notion, as I said, that growth always leads to development, which is untrue, and we reject that notion, and so we try to say why we reject it. The first thing is growth leads to development, but only when it generates a process where most of the people, they have a standard of living which is above the basic minimum. It should be a case that people have at least enough to eat, a roof above their head, the basic necessities, that should be there. In absence of it, one can't say that even when there is growth, if so many people are left out, excluded, how can one say that there has been development? So that's the first thing, that it has to generate some goal of a universal basic minimum for all in the country. Then, but this is disputed, this is contested by those who believe in trickle down, and those groups are led by the mainstream economics, mainstream policies. The arguments are simple. I'm putting it in a very simple framework, simple language. I'm not going to enter into the technical details. So the second part, to view it, what do they say? The mainstream economics. What have we achieved through that, or what have they? Thank you. So then, opening up markets. So let the markets be opened up, and that will lead to flows of commodities, flows of capital, and not flows of people, however. then that will lead to eventually to high growth rates because it is efficient. Everything will be produced. I'll enter into those arguments a little later. That efficiency will come by, and that will mean that growth will be generated. And then, well, there are some countries amongst the emerging and developing. Now they are described as EMD, emerging and developing market economies. I think two countries needs to be mentioned. One is China and the second one is India. These are the high growth countries among developing world. Yes, but at the same time, they they are ridden with rising inequalities. In China also, inequalities moving up in recent years. It has been quite high, and poverty, especially India. So both these things, inequities and poverties, they are visible despite high growth and low development indices and so on. Anyway, we'll come to those. Then globalization, again we go back to the mainstream. What do they say? What do they want to preach? They will say that there is efficiency. There is efficiency achieved by opening up the markets, and that is the logic of the free market. That if everybody works according to one's own rational decision, this is methodological individualism, that if each one, you and me, we all work according to our self-interest, and if we know everything, how to operate in the market, how to produce, there is no uncertainty. So all these things put together, this is a voluntary exchange by actors who are rational. They very much, and you cannot be rational if there is uncertainty, if there are things which are unknown. Therefore, there is, through this process, there will be gains, which will include gains from trade, comparative advantage, whatever you say, or inside the country, and gains from exchange, and however you need to achieve all this, one needs full information, economy of scale, and market access and efficiency. So this is, in very broad, in very simple terms, this is a framework in terms of which the those who advocate logic of the free market, in terms of methodological individualism, this is how it comes about. Now, what are the limiting assumptions? Already I hinted at that. Where is competition? There is monopoly, there is a concentration. Then, not all resources are utilized, especially unemployment is there. Full employment is a myth, and including, and even capital can lay idle if there is recession. Then information is never complete. There may be asymmetry, but even asymmetry can be rated as incomplete. So information, how do people react how do people work in the market when they don't know the whole story? They don't know how, in which direction it will move. They have to then speculate. They have to then predict on some basis. We'll come to that. Then is it fair? Well, the mainstream economists will say yes, it is fair, because each one is getting remuneration according to one's contribution. This is a simple that Euler's theorem and all that. What you are getting is how much you contributed marginally to the production process, and therefore it is fair. And if you are paid like that, if your wages are at par with your marginal productivity, there should not be any complication. There should not be any problem. It is not only efficient, but it is also fair. However, markets have failed. Markets have failed to generate development. This is very clear. This is very obvious when you look around. There is unemployment. There is labor displacement. Technology has often, in countries where alternate jobs are not available, then introduction of technology may mean that labor is displaced, and then helpless, they cannot find an alternative position. Similarly, there are other kinds of displacement, especially in countries like India and other countries also, displacement of land. With industrialization, there is this process that they sort of clear the land and take over. Maybe in a huge plot of land which they take over, peasants were there. They are growing crops, and they do not have any option. They may be compensated marginally, but that will not last long. So their lifelong occupation, their source of income for the rest of their life, that goes. So that kind of a displacement which happens with industrialization, that's a big debate. How far can it go? Why should there be? And then who profits from industrialization? Not those who are displaced immediately, neither maybe with technology, neither labor, and here nor the agriculturists. Then, of course, displacements, etc. happen, and it brings in situations of poverty, situations of inequity, and if there is lack of demand, excess capacity, instability of markets, you don't know in which direction it goes. We'll come to that later again. And so instability. So through this process, we'll come to, I'll try to describe it a little bit. The world is changing. The developing countries, the emerging market developing, etc., the advanced countries, all over the world, one notices a process where there is financial boom. There is financial boom because people are sort of drawn to activities which relate to finance, which relate to financial assets and so on. So there is a financial boom, but that financial boom is not one which is bringing in real activity. So we have to. I think one needs to look at it carefully and see. And I'll provide some more simple explanations for that. Financialization, what does it do? What is financialization, first of all? As I just said, there is financial boom. Now, if there is financial boom, how did it come about? It came about because a lot of people are attracted to financial assets. So, in the economy as a whole, what is happening? That assets are held more in the form of financial assets rather than those which are held against real activity. As you talk about stock markets, you talk about other types of bonds, a lot of things. They are all financial assets. And here, one can notice. In fact, we have done a paper where we studied Indian corporates, and we found amazing that the Indian corporates today are holding their surpluses more as financial assets from the stock market, more as liquidity, which can be more as a financial asset which can be converted to liquidity. But on the whole, they are not interested in investing their surpluses in expanding the factory. So this is a peculiar situation. The corporates, if the corporates do not invest in their own business, they have some profits. Where do the profits go? If the profits are not reinvested, well, you can't expect an expansion of the factory, right? In which case, then the next question, what do they do with the surpluses? Well, what they do is, and who are they? Mostly financial managers, the manager of a company, of a corporate company, right? So the manager, what he will do, will invest it in such a form that the balance sheet of the company looks much brighter. And that can only happen when he can invest, he does invest in financial assets, because even though it is volatile, but on the whole, the rate of return is much higher compared to real assets. And the rate of return is much higher simply because more people want the financial asset. Demand is more for financial assets rather than for real assets. Please tell me if there is any communication problem, if I need to speak more slowly. just tell me, yeah?
For us, it's fine.
Alright. So therefore, if they're holding, if they're increasingly holding these financial assets, well, this is one impact of financialization, where financialization started with deregulation. Of course, I should mention that with deregulated finance, you can hold any kinds of financial assets, and that in turn is very lucrative because the rate of return on those assets are very often higher compared to the real assets. So this is the story. Therefore, the corporate investments in a country like India, I have got data where in a paper we published, we find it's happening. And if you look at the portfolio of the corporates, you will find the proportion held as in against industries, that is something not more than 30%, and the rest is going to financial. Then this is something which the managers like to do. Why? Because very often in the corporates, they are paid in terms of the stocks of the same company or other companies. This is known as ESOP, employees stock option. So if that is the case, then it lies in their own interest, self-interest, that they invest in financial, and they also, they will profit, because if the company is, company stocks are a bit priced higher, then they gain because they hold it. Okay. Then the next one is, how is financial operating? Well, with decontrol, with deregulation of finance, a country in principle can receive any amount of funds from outside in any form. It can be foreign direct investment, it can also be portfolio investment, short-term portfolio investments which come to the country just to park, and then whenever the situation is bad, when it is not going well, they can move out. These are the FIIs, foreign institutional investors, etc. So integration with the global finance exposes any particular country, any economy to instabilities, because even though a lot of money is coming, for example in India, right, a lot of money has come as portfolio, foreign institutional investors are investing, but they're not investing it for long term. It's not foreign direct investment. So when they come, however, it can push up the exchange rate, so the central bank will buy the currency and hold it, which means the reserves will move up, which reflects a good situation. But it is precarious situation because any time capital can leave. In fact, India is having an election next year at 2019. And people are very, whether we like the government or not, that's another matter. Personally, I don't like. But so everybody is hoping that, well, it will be a change, it will be a big change. But let that change come. Even in the state level election, whenever the established government, established power which is ruling the government, whenever they are displaced a little, immediately the stock market reacts. That's the first reaction. Big capital immediately reacts and money goes out. So integration is not always a very desired thing, but it has happened. It is happening, and in the process, what happens that countries lose their autonomy in policies. Like why you have, I'm sure many of you know about this impossible trinity, that monetary policy cannot be autonomous when you have free foreign exchange, when you fix the exchange rate, and also money is coming very easily to your country. In other words, when capital flows are unrestricted, when exchange rate is at a certain level and the country wants to maintain that exchange rate, say overvalued or undervalued, whatever, if you want to maintain the exchange rate, you have to buy the foreign exchange, put it in your reserve, and if the reserve, high-powered money goes up, then your money supply goes, so there is some kind of an, if you believe in that kind of a process, whatever. So on the whole, it's very difficult to pitch the rate of interest at a level which is beneficial for the real sector, for industry. Very often interest rate is pitched rather high because that encourages capital to come to the country, that also maintains the exchange rate and so on. So I think, if you accept this argument, then we just remember this impossible trinity aspect, that country cannot maintain independence in policy, especially financial policy, monetary policy, when there is litigation. And there comes the question of the nation state. The authority of the nation state very often gets eroded when something like that happens. Then the banks have a very different role. With financialization, very often they look at the highest rate of income, sort of how they can maximize that income, and very often what happens that they are more keen to operate in the banks are keen to operate in the speculatory stock markets, and on and off, if the rate of interest is pitched high, the industry cannot prosper because by perforce the banks are maintaining the interest rate rather high. Okay, therefore it's bad for domestic industry. Then there is some kind of a situation which is particularly related to India, fiscal restraint and budget monetary policy or something, FRBA. There is a very peculiar, what do I say? Long back when the IMF was giving loans to many other countries, especially in Latin America, also to India, those loans came with conditionality. And a major part of the conditionality was that you have to cut down, you have to keep your level of expenditure rather low by cutting down fiscal deficit and also pitching the rate of interest rather. Oops. I'm very sorry, I should have. Okay. I would have liked this, but I have done it. Please stop. Let's stop. Okay. So what is this restraint? The restraint tells the IMF introduced this whole notion, and the Bretton Woods institutions, that after all, unless expenditure is cut down, you cannot maintain, you cannot avoid inflation, and inflation is unhealthy for investments, for investors, and therefore and so on and so forth. So that notion, that kind of a argument is continuing, and even today big capital, financial capital, will not come to a country if there is very high inflation. And because financial capital does not want to reach your country when there is high inflation, the policy makers will try to control inflation by cutting down expenditure with smaller budgetary spending and with higher rate of interest. This I would call fiscal monetary restraint. Okay. Now this fiscal monetary restraint or the contractions, what does it lead to? It leads to expenditure, cuts in expenditure in the budget in certain forms, like social sector. Social sector expenditure is the first one to be hit. Then capital expenditure by the state is the second one, or along with it social expenditure, they are hit. And at the same time, earlier in India, the central bank could get on loan money from the government, fiscal. But now that is over. Now, if the budget has to run a deficit, that deficit has to be met by borrowing from the market. So market borrowing is the only solution for any budget deficit. Okay. First of all, budget deficit is coming down, therefore expenditure comes down. And second, that if there is any deficit left, it has to be filled it has to be covered by market borrowing. Well, if there is market borrowing, then what happens? You also have to meet the payments when you borrow from the market. Interest has to be paid, and how does it paid? How is it met? None other than the budget. So in the budget, a large chunk, increasing chunk of expenditure is going to meet the interest payment, which goes to the raw. At the same time, what is happening, that other forms of expenditure, which leads to production, which leads to welfare, they are very steadily cut. So this is another matter. Subsidies, social sector spending. However, I don't think I should relate it to China, because China has followed a very different path. As you know, after the global financial crisis, enormous amounts were spent by the state, and that led to some kind of a stability. China did not face the global financial crisis at that time. And fiscal expansion is a major tool, and monetary control. China faced the Trinity a little bit, like China also was maintaining the rate of interest rather high for some time. I've got a small paper if you want, I can give it to you. Then finally, there is a rise in speculation, naturally, because there is uncertainty, and if I have to do something which the consequence of which I do not know, well, I want to hedge myself, and therefore with uncertainty you find that if I am speculating, well, I also need to hedge. Hedge and speculation are almost come hand in hand, and therefore there is financial markets, they are receiving all kinds of money, portfolio money which is very fragile, and portfolio money which wants to speculate in the market, and also other kinds of speculatory motives are there, not only in the money market, not only with funds, financial funds, but also even in the commodity market, in the currency market, in the real estate market. In all these uncertain areas, uncertain terrain, you find that uncertainty itself is responsible for hedging, which is one tool of speculation. Okay. You can always stop me if there is any question, or later on maybe. Now I talk about the two countries, more or less on India, but just a little bit on China as a contrast. China grew very fast. By 2010, it was growing at 10.5%. And the growth rate slowly came down, but it's still very high, around 8.5, 8.6%, till about 14. Now more recently, it is something like 6.5, 6.8, 6.7 that. This has happened particularly because China's exports have been hit overseas. Given the recession, continuing recession in the West, Chinese goods, even though when you go to the market you find the cheapest stuff is from China, and the consumers of course will buy it, but on the whole the recession has cut down demand to some extent in the West, in advanced countries, and China was exporting huge quantities, these values to these countries. So therefore, given the shortfall in export, then Chinese policymakers, they turned back and they did something like, they announced publicly that from now on, we do not want to rely so much on exports. China relies on USA so much for export earnings. But so today's China, they say that we want to look at the domestic market, which is a very sensible thing to do. And they say we cut down our growth rate, we don't want that kind of 10% growth, but let us have something which they call new normal growth of rate of growth, and it is directed, it is geared to the domestic economy. Then China is also trying, as you know, the regional agreements like the BRICS and OBOR, One Belt, One Road. other institutions have come up. But my slide, I have worked on these things. I mean, when I look at these things, I have only one problem, one issue to ask, that, well, maybe they are trying to again revive their growth, but will it be enough for inequality? China is going through very, very deep inequalities within the country. And poverty, well, about poverty, as per some household survey, according to it, World Bank has got a criteria, $1.90 per day, very little. And according to this CHIP survey, poverty rate declined from 32% to 11% between 2002 to 2010, which is a remarkable achievement. And World Bank gives some hit count ratio, which is, I do not know what is the correct one, very low, but forget it. But this CHIP survey, a lot of people are working on it, and it shows that poverty rate actually has come down. And the state actions are there in the direction of moderate welfare provisions. And however, inequality is high. Inequality is high with, in terms of political inequality. A lot of people who are in the party, as you know, the Chinese premier is now going to continue for a very long time. And the party, of course, is still very supreme, but the party composition is changing because the relatively rich people, they are having their children, their younger people in the party, in the Politburo, and well, that may impact in future the continuing social security measures, which will be dreadful. Okay, on India. What is happening in India? Growth. Again, it was quite high earlier, 10%, but it's not that high now, 9%, 7%, and there is debate on the GDP. There was a change in weightage system and so on. But on the whole, take it from me that growth rate has fallen, but at the same time, it's one of the highest growth countries in the world. And very often people, those who are the growth lobbyists, the growth lobbyists will say, look, we are growing at a faster rate than China. Well, that's that. What does it lead to? Let's see. What are the sources of growth? How did India achieve such growth? Services, which include financial services, which include many other kinds of services, it provides 54% of GDP today, and it grows very fast. It is growing at 10% per year, and the services include the insurance, real estate, and finance. FIRE stands for finance, insurance, real estate, plus the trade. Respectively, FIRE grows at 22% per year, and trade also grows like 19%. Very high rate of growth. And then they contribute to the gross value added, GVA, 67% they are contributing. So you can see how the growth miracle has happened in India. It is not through production, it is not through agriculture. Agriculture is growing less than 1%, very bad thing, and you find distress, farmer distress, very acute. And industry also is not doing very well. Sometimes, quarterly data shows promise, then it goes down. And how can it grow? Because there is not much demand. If not enough people are there to demand commodities from the industrial sector, it is unlikely that industry can move fast, you see. And given the inequality, there is inequality, of course. The part of the services sector is, the growth in services sector is contributed both by deregulation of finance and other activities, and also some inequality, because they demand services. The richer people, they can demand services, and then service can help some kind of a niche of the market. Sources of employment. So I thought, I will explain the absence of development by linking, I mean, on the one hand, take it that growth is fast, growth is high. At the same time, look at the other side of the coin. What is happening what is happening and who is contributing to growth. We just had a look at that. This thing that the sources of growth are like that. However, then we need to know that if the sources of growth are like that, does it generate income via employment? Well, my answer will be again no, because we find the sources of employment in the organized sector, this sector, in this organized sector, you find very few people are employed. By organized, I mean the formal sector, which was subject to labor laws, which provides some benefits to the workers, which provides some permanence, permanent jobs, tenured jobs, and so on. This is the organized sector, but that provides only 10 to 20%. In fact, some years back we did a study. There is a certificate book of mine where we found 10-12%, and that's it. And out of that again, 54% today, increasingly, casualization is happening. You know what is casualization? People are employed, but not on a permanent long-term basis. They are employed in a manner that they can have a job, but any day they can be fired. So 54% of people employed in the formal sector today are having jobs which are not permanent, they are casual jobs. So therefore there remain the unorganized sector, which provides most of the jobs, and which also agriculture is a major part of the unorganized sector, and the informal status for many workers, most workers, 95% of the workforce have informal status. Alternate job opportunities are very little, very few, and the service sector, despite the fact that they are providing 54% of output, they are providing very few jobs. Then how did it happen? How is it that employment is not growing in the country, especially in the formal sector, etc.? What is the situation? Well, very quickly I tell you that the labor legislation has changed dramatically in India from some benefits to labor to a situation where it is none. Labor benefits have really drastically been cut. This is the new pattern of policy making, new laws. So changes in labor laws, you don't have to go through the whole thing, but on the whole, it has ended the period when labor could expect a permanent job with superannuation benefits, medical benefits, home leave, and so on. This is passé today, and as a consequence, we also find that wage share of labor in the GDP, that also is not going up. Okay? Naturally, how can you expect? Then the consequence is obvious that there is no development, which it's described as human development. With human development, you find you look not only just income, but you look at the health, you look at education, look at the shelter, and that's the quality of life. But and in this context, GDP does not, per capita GDP, it cannot provide an indication as to whether human development has increased. You divide the whole income, GDP, by the number of people or by the number of workers, but that doesn't mean that there is human development, nor the Gini coefficient, the inequality index. Therefore, the market fails to ensure human development, and one needs state intervention. Otherwise, it cannot be achieved, because the market will not do it. Then, what are the indices? These are the UNDP indices. The UNDP indices for India is very, very poor, very little, very low. 131 among 185 countries, imagine. So, in 2015, and the gender equity index is also very bad. like 125 and so on. There are structural changes. Structural changes in the country which simply has pushed aside, pushed away the developmental state in India. There was a development. It started after independence as a developmental state with some kind of benefits for as welfare. Also industrialization, it was believed that industrialization will give more jobs and that will improve, and there will be self-reliance and so on. So parallel in this, we observe that there is, institutions are important, and we find that in the context of the structural change, institutions are getting a very different color. Here, with the compliance of the free market, it is, here I think I need to talk a little bit about the two types of institutional economics which many of you have come across. One is this new institutional economics, Coase and North and so on, and the other one, old form, Commons, Hodgson. So with old forms, it's believed that institutions are there and the individuals are not bringing up the institutions, but they are influenced by the institutions, right? So in that context, in India also, the pattern of the institutions are changing, the banks no longer lend to those who are financially excluded because it is not profitable for the banks, and the state stops the subsidies, etc. There are many examples there can be, especially with privatization. The role of the state is minimized, state is pushed aside, then budgetary cuts which we mentioned, then cuts in social spending, public investment goes down, flexibility of labor, financial deregulation, development is pushed to the backstage with the process where the state is something like a predatory state for capital. The state will come and help out who? Help out big capital, because it is in terms of this capitalist state, the state is also benefiting much from big capital. Even in terms of within democracy, you have elections which are funded by a lot of financiers or big capital. And there is some kind of a, if you talk about the capitalists, there's some kind of a class alliance which is going on. The class alliance is, there was always class alliance, but the class alliance is changing within and across the country. It is changing. National bourgeoisie today are very keen to have alliances with foreign capital. It is not that like the earlier years. Earlier years when protection was the norm, because otherwise the domestic market cannot develop. But today's norm, with WTO and many other things, you see, the norm is that, you get cheaper commodities from abroad, no problem, and you get free technology, of course not free, there are royalties and so on, and you get inputs which are imported. All these things will lead to efficiency. And what does it matter if part of the industrial activities are also owned by foreign capital, because there is foreign collaboration, joint ventures, and so on. So it's a very changed class alliance within and across nations. So where is the nation state? I do not think the nation state stands with the same stature as it used to be earlier. The nation state is there, but the nation state is not subordinated, but is subject to certain situations, conditions which prevail, which is beyond the nation state. Nation state has to accept deregulation of finance, because otherwise capital will not come. It has to accept many other policies which are not particularly in favor of those who are poor within the nation state, but those which are acceptable to those who rule the government. Weight of finance, it has tremendously increased. Finance today is really at the top of decision making. In the process, it generates a very new type of capital, and this term I borrowed from Professor Casualization, the new capital. You remember when we used to, okay. So this new capital, it is a very different pattern of capital, which where finance has a major role, and there is a systematic transformation of the power structure and policies which is going on. So on the whole, to make it simple, what has been happening is that finance has a big role both in advocating policies to the state and also in controlling the market. And in this process, the real sector is not something which gets the first priority. So this is the new pattern, and new capital is taking this kind of pattern. And there are naturally, one can expect that the pro-finance policies are very active, and they are laden with the class interest of those whose assets are primarily financial claims in the market. You see, these are the rentier classes who earn income as profit, interest, dividends, earnings on the stocks and so on. And they also control policies. The stock market just reacts. It's almost like an animal. I'm not talking about the bulls and the bears, but the stock market, the way it sharply reacts to any political change, that indicates, that gives a feeler that, look, don't take this direction, we'll go away. Money will leave your country. So this is the era of dominant finance. Can I continue another 10 minutes?
Look.
So this is the era of, age of dominant capital all over the world, not India as such, but in China also, for capital like that, big capital, flexible capital is very common all over the world, in advanced countries as well. And the financial deregulation which has happened, it has introduced some changes. One of them is that with deregulation, when you don't have any regulation, when you don't have any control over the interest rate, over the exchange rate, over the flows of capital, over the type of capital, what is happening, that there is a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot of uncertainty. It's very hazy. The market is not very clear market. Can't see through. But it's very hazy, and it means uncertain future. With rising uncertainty, there is a demand that something has to be done. Already I mentioned this earlier, that with speculation you need to hedge. You need to have some kind of a protection to keep cows away from your garden, a bit like that. So in the financial market also, when I'm taking a venture, when I'm taking a risky venture, I want to do something more in order that I don't face very sharp losses. Yeah. So these are the hedging procedure. So what are the hedging procedures? Lot of instruments have come up. In general, you put them together and they are called derivatives. Very appropriate name, because they are not the original stock, but they are derived, from the initial stock which is sold. Okay. So what do the derivatives do? They enter into contracts, like forward market contract, when there is no exchange, when there is no written thing over that. Forward markets can be between two people over the counter. And similarly, there can be options, there can be other hedges, etc. So these are the new instruments which have come up. And these instruments are financed by the banks, by many other financial agents. So a lot of money is now diverted from number one, from the initial primary sector. When a factory is open, they want to sell the primary stocks. So from there it has come to the secondary stock market. And the secondary stock market is one where the same share which somebody has bought from the primary market can be bought and sold a number of times and make profit, because capital gains will come up. Now, when you are operating in the secondary stock market, well, what you do, you make a contract that 3 months from now I will buy the stock at a higher price, but not as high as in the market, or not as low. So there is some kind of a certainty about the price of the stock after 3 months, which is very beneficial for which the agent will find beneficial. So to continue a little bit more, this is financial engineering. I don't have to go into the detail, I'm sure you know all about it. So these are the derivatives as hedging instruments, and the returns are quite high, and the assets are, price of the assets are volatile, and therefore they are more attractive compared to real assets. Okay. So this is happening with deregulation, and flows of portfolio finance across countries is also happening. Then I ask this question, that how do the agents, when they are entering these contracts, when they are putting money in risky assets, how do they decide? Well, I find it very surprising that they decide on the basis of the standard models which are there in the market, which tell them that this stock is beneficial, that stock is not. That kind of thing. These are known as the very famous Black-Scholes model in the stock market, which tell you that you can just take this package, put it in your computer, have some data as to what had been the price of the stock in the past, and then you can find out what is going to be the future price, and if it suits you, you do. Okay, this kind of a thing. So if that is the thing, then what are the assumptions on which these models are based? Again, another thing which is amazing, that these models rely on notions of probability which are not correct, which are very very primitive, because they believe that what they can calculate, this formula is calculated on the basis of normal distribution of probability. Now, who says that probabilities are behaving in a manner that you can have a normal curve so that you can calculate the standard deviation? It doesn't have any logic, it doesn't have any basis. And here, by doing that, they are ruling out uncertainty which will affect their business. Okay. So this in very brief and very simple form, I tell you how markets are deciding on investment, how investment is decided by agents in the market. However, long back, these debates came up, starting from earlier period when, I don't have to enter into, don't have time to do those things. Probability initially used to be thought that it is something like utilitarian. You can calculate probability by something, you are acting in a direction which is good, and therefore it helps your utility. And later on, Keynes pointed out in Treatise on Probability that look, this is something like a rational act, and the degree of belief, it depends on how much you know out of the unknowns. Okay, so this is the ratio, like it used to say, Keynes say, this is some kind of a degree of belief which is alpha, which is a ratio between A, which is the known objects, and H, which is the universe. Okay, so that ratio tells you that you are what is the degree of faith, what is the degree of belief. This alpha is your probability. Now there is one statement in treatise which I want to mention because of a certain reason. The treatise, Keynes himself says, treatise 1920, much before general theory of 36. Keynes points out that look, when you add your informations, that does not lead to more, that does not strengthen your probability. Why? Because when you add in more information, you may find some of the information is negating, the outcome. So if you have H and say A by H, right? If H becomes H plus delta H, then that delta H does not necessarily contribute to a larger alpha, because this new information may contradict, what you believe in. Now, this I find quite interesting, because the way the probability calculations are done, and even regressions in econometrics, when they have a longer time series, people think that this will help them out more. But that's not the case, because out of that time series, a part may negate, what you were trying to achieve it. So that kind of. And also, the actions by the agents, they may create further uncertainty. This is fundamental uncertainty, where, by operating in the market, the market is so fluid that, that itself may change it in any direction. And that is the primary form of uncertainty, where probability cannot be calculated so easily. Kate himself says that in certain situations we do not know. Now then, faulty decision process therefore is guiding all our investments, and that is the reason why very often we find that there is so much of instability. Global financial crisis is one classic example, and many other cases. This decision process itself is faulty, and however this is encouraged by state policies which are controlled by big finance. Then financialization, it also has affected investment decisions, as I mentioned. It affects the shadow bank, it affects the corporate shadow banks, mutual fund industry, money lenders, households, commodity, currency market. If there is time, we'll come back to it. Then capital gains and losses. Then, through this process, a lot of people, lot of agents are gaining or they are losing. However, those gains and losses, capital gains and losses for the rentiers, it does not generate output. This is a transfer, and therefore it has no link, it has no relation to expansion of the real economy. So I think I almost come to the conclusion that I find 3 points here, which is worth remembering, which is worth mentioning, reiterating. Finance-led growth, which is happening all over, it does not contribute expansions in the real sector, which we are trying to point out. And much of the, as for the Indian growth, much of the Indian growth seen, it has been generated by financial and other services without generating output and employment. Finance-dominated growth, it generates policies which retard human development, which has been retarded. There is no development. HDI indexes will not necessarily move up when high growth India or high growth in China is there. China's HDI is not so good. Then finance-led growth is also responsible for instability, which has been very visible. The corrections of which, however, it generates further contractions of the real sector very often.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Professor Sen, for this deep and enlightening conversation piece that you offered us. Well, now I think that if you agree, maybe to answer some questions from the floor. Questions from the floor are much welcome. Dr. Galanis.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. I have two short questions.
Sorry?
First of all,
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
One question is, so I've worked in wage-led, profit-led growth based on the Baduri margin model, and I'm interested in your view. So you have high growth, but it's based on finance. Does this mean, it does not mean actually that necessarily you could have wage-led growth, which could be both good for workers or for development and also being able to. Is this possible in the countries that you focus, you think? I mean, our results show that it is possible, but I mean, what's your view? And the second thing I wanted to ask is, so let's say I have a stock and I gain from this. So in order to have the financialization, as you said, then you have to have high profits in the stock market, right? So I'm thinking in terms of this new finance capital or finance capitalist, who is there, as there is a class of winners, if you want, this type of capitalist, is there a specific group of people that lose such that the other people gain? Because if I have a stock, in order to make profit, I have to sell it to someone who has to buy it. So there is some type of exploitation there, as Lapovitz has called it. So, yeah.
Maybe you prefer to answer immediately, or you prefer to correct?
I think I can answer.
Okay. Yeah.
About wage-led and profit-led growth. Profit-led growth, which kind of profit? If it is coming from production, that's one matter. But if it is coming entirely from speculation, that is very different. You see that, and as you rightly say, that the capital gains, etc., they are not generating output, right? They are transfers. So therefore, if it is coming from the financial assets only, then I think growth, to continue growth in the real sector will be rather difficult. And of course, wage-led is always, wage-led growth is always feasible. You know?
Okay.
That is natural. Yeah. So I think I'm combining the two. That because capital gains and capital losses, they are not related to real sector. You know, so that's it.
So there's no class of people that lose specifically, right?
Yeah. But I sometimes feel that there has to be some kind of a multiplier. That those who are getting more money because of this whole process, they are also going to the supermarkets and they're buying things. And that second round, third round, if that is strong enough, that can generate some growth. But
Thanks.
Other question? Yes, please.
I thank you also for your very interesting presentation. And I wanted to ask you your opinion on, in this case, maybe connected to India, but also to other cases. You talk about the predatory state in
sorry, can you
the predatory state.
I talk about
The development state. You
No,
said.
the predatory state.
Predatory state.
The alliance between the state and this new capital, this new wealth capital. I wanted to know if in India's case, it may not be a continuing on the previous state before the developmental state in terms of political alliances or maybe political parties, and maybe if this is, or it could be also seen in a post-colonial way. Maybe it is a situation connected with the fact that these are post-colonial countries.
I don't know whether I got the point clearly. You say that, yes, the predatory state, etc., but in the post-colonial situation, whether the state can be identified like that. Is this the question?
No, I reformulate maybe because of
Sorry.
it. You told that this kind of state, in this way, acting with the financial capital, could be seen as a way of being in an alliance, the state and the capital. I wanted to know if this could be seen as a continuity of before the developmental state in India, before these policies that went on growth, on real development. Because, for example, my question was connected to other emerging countries where we had this attempt on the 1980s, maybe with growth, with development approach, but now they are turning their backs and they are going towards this financial growth level.
Yeah, I think you know you have. I think you are trying to say you are mentioning one point which is very interesting. I think you hinted at that. You see, before the development state, India was not born with the developmental state. That is the post-independence, about a decade, right? And then it is changing. But before that, there was the colonial state. And in the colonial state, well, it is not a developmental state at all. It is a complete predatory state where, you know, the British who ruled India, they would rather appropriate as much surplus as possible and take it out, that kind of thing. So that is it. And second thing which you're mentioning, that, you know, many other countries are also going through this predatory pattern. And yes, you know, I also ask myself, why did it happen? You know, why so many countries at one go, they are trying to follow this pattern? What for? Possibly the answer is that because finance capital is so dominant, they want, I mean the state again is predatory, and therefore it is not, it does not want to make finance unhappy, you know.
But my point was if it could be seen also as a way to come back to that period before the developmental state, that in a way to continue the status quo before the developmental state and to continue the type of society of colonial period.
Correct, sure. Because in this case, yes, if you know what you're saying is, I agree that, you know, the previous, if we compare the pre-independence India with what is happening at the moment, what is happening at the moment is that surplus is taken out by big capital. And what used to happen at those days, it used to be taken out, it was the nation state, but the ruling state, England in particular, they will take it out, you know. So the characters have changed, you know, but the mode is the same.
My question was then, are the characters really changed? Because who is the lead in the society? For example, in some countries, in Latin American countries, are the same families that were in those periods, maybe. So it was just an idea that it may be it may be seen as a continuity of a want to come back of that mentality, maybe, of that approach.
Yeah, one hopes that it will come back to development state. Why not? Why not? But that should that will be preceded by a change in the government, change in the kind of support to the government by people.
Thank you.
Very good question.
Yes. Other questions? Yes, please.
Well, some days ago in our lesson of international marketing during our university, we had the opportunity to read a case about what Unilever did in India in order to try to change the situation of poverty through the Project Shakti.
Through the?
Project Shakti, with the women.
Shakti.
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 Yeah, I don't know if it's in Indian it's this way to pronounce it.
What is it?
It was a way to make women of India able to sell themselves things from Unilever. But Unilever is a multinational, so I would like to know what you think about the role of multinationals in India, since India it's not a really rich country, so I would like to know what's the situation there.
Yeah. You see, multinationals have come in a big way now. I mean, just the other day there was this Flipkart and some takeover. Anyway, the retail business is now going to be Walmart, for example. Walmart has come in a big way. Earlier, you know, there was resistance, because if a company like Walmart takes over all retail business, then the small business will go. You know, a lot of people, they don't have so much capital. They have a small shop, your corner shop and that kind of thing. And they provide employment to a lot of people, unorganized sector. So multinational corporations today, even though they sell commodities, they source it from very cheap sources. Therefore, they can compete very successfully with other people, with small retailers. But at the same time, that will deprive the small business from their occupation and employment and income, that kind of thing. And about the Shakti, I think what you heard is that women power, to what extent it can generate development in the country. I don't think till now, unfortunately, I don't see that happening, but certainly women are far more active compared to before and far more socially oriented. I shouldn't say far more, but they are socially oriented, the women's groups, a lot of them, yes. But not much is happening, no. Thank you. But multinationals it's a big name now. They have come and they are taking over the whole huge domestic market, 1.2 billion people.
Yes.
How do you analyze the role of microfinance in India?
What is
The role of microfinance.
Yes. Role of microfinance is, in fact, right. You see, what happens, like in Bangladesh, a number of groups, they form self-service, self-sustaining groups and so on. And they started like cooperative. And then gradually microfinance has been taken over as business by some big, people, companies which can borrow from, which are eligible to borrow from banks, but the companies also, microfinance companies, they lend it out to people who are unbanked. You see the link, a group of people, people who are financially excluded because of the fact that they are not only poor, but they don't have an address, they cannot provide collaterals, and the banks have to follow the rules laid down by the Basel, like Basel II, that you have to follow that credit risk adjusted load, CRAR, and that kind of thing. So the link is this: here lies the people who are unbanked. Here lies the microfinance, the intermediaries. And the microfinance can get money from the formal banks, formal banking sector, and lend it to these people. And however, the interest rate is not comparable. Interest rate is much higher compared to the formal sector, that credit. And at the same time, what they have been doing is two things they are doing, interesting. One is that when they lend, naturally they create an asset. It is an asset. If I lend you money, I have an asset which I can securitize, right? The ABSs and so on. So they securitize and they earn a lot of money through that. And the other thing is that those who are borrowing, they often do not have the capacity to pay back or capacity to service the loan. Okay. So if they don't have the capacity to service or pay back, then what happens, however, the microfinance companies, they insist that you cannot stop, you should continue, I'll give you another loan. So it's a bit like a Ponzi finance, What happens that the poor people, they borrow with one hand and they take the money and give it back, you see. So there is no surplus which they can utilize for their own production. What is happening? For example, a farmer is getting some seed loans and so on. Well, it will buy the seeds, of course, but it is getting the seed loan from the MFI, from the microfinance, and it will use the seeds for production. Then it has some surplus, some profit or whatever after selling, and that money, it simply goes out, it sweeps off because it has to pay back the MFI. So there is no cushion for the farmer, and also with the compounding, the debt goes on, debt increases enormously. So this has been one problem. And in this context, let me complete because I have a small paper on this. The other part of microfinance is they run parallel business with the money lenders in the villages in the context of India. And on the one hand, they provide very much needed finance. On the other hand, it's not generating benefits for production. And the last thing is that the MFI is also some kind of informal organizations. They have been lending to rather rich business people, and they have misused the money, and which is another part. And that may mean that if they don't pay, for example, Bigiavi, one character, he's a big industrialist. He has somehow borrowed a lot of money from Indian banks, and the banks are in trouble. But Bigiavi is sitting in London. Then another two people, couple the last few days, they ran away with a lot of money from another bank. But they cannot be, they're abroad. So look around, there may be some more people. So that kind of thing, it's a very complex issue. MFIs, on the one hand, they're useful, they're providing money, but at the same time, if it does not help out materially those who are borrowing, then it doesn't serve the purpose. Yes.
I have a question. Like in 2008, we all faced the global crisis, and it was kind of the same situation in the US. Like they created bubbles by using these kind of financial derivatives, and like we all knew the consequences. Like they created bubbles, and in the end, it's like exploded. But like in India, doesn't the government doesn't the government think that they will face these kind of situation in the end? Because as I understood from your speech that they're changing their institutions, they are creating new form of institutions in favor of financial markets. I mean, doesn't the government take any precautions to prevent this kind of situation?
Yes. The first part of your question, that what happened in 2008 is interesting. In the case of China, it spent enormous amounts, but in the case of India also, there was a governor to the central bank, Y.B. Reddy, and he was a very wise person, He took policies which really helped out to avoid the impact, He reduced the rate of interest a little bit. India also has stimulant packages, fiscal spending, additional ones. But even those phases are over now. Now if there is another crisis, I do not think the state will be ready to provide that kind of a cushion. You see, that is the thing. So, but because the second part of your question, that why the government simply its hands are tied because lot of profit is there in speculation of real estate, currency market, commodity market, and of course money market. So the speculation and increasingly they are allowing more of these funds. Not just FIIs, but hedge funds and other kinds of speculation. There is no bar. So I don't think whatever we write, they don't read it. It doesn't work. Yeah. Yes, I think speculation has to be stopped. Otherwise, the real economy will never prosper.
I just because it's just. India is a huge country with a huge population, and I don't understand why in a way, you could create a huge domestic market.
Absolutely.
If you would invest in real films and production. So I don't know, maybe it's because they're maybe you have these alliances and these small circles who maybe just thinking about themselves and not about because. Yeah. Otherwise, I'm not understanding how.
No, you're very right. Yeah. Why that state doesn't think of the domestic market? Well, I think to do that it has to generate jobs, and that's absolutely desired thing. but at the same time, because it is bound by interest of big capital, which is finance, you know, it is not so much, it is not as much interested to protect the real economy as it is to protect the financial market. You know, if there is anything, slightest tinkering of the financial market, the state is very careful not to touch it. You know, even politically, you know, those who rule the country, they are very careful about the financial market, but less about who cares about poverty. Yes.
And I know it's just so not understandable because I think India has a huge potential for domestic market. You know?
Absolutely.
It's just not.
I think India should learn a little bit from China to some extent, but China's financial also is not in very good shape. It is. But at the same time, it has realized, immediately it has turned back and said, look, we want our domestic demand. We don't want that kind of growth. And China is driven by industry. India is driven by services. You see, that's it.
Other questions? Well, you. No, sorry, I thought you already read. Sorry. I have a question actually, or a couple of questions really. Well, you've been talking about finance and financialization, but I mean, one could think that behind finance, at perhaps a more fundamental level in the everyday working of also the real economies, lies the issue of debt-credit relationships. I mean, debt-credit relationships are not necessarily pathological. Of course, debt-credit relationships are also physiological, because clearly, I mean, if you think of a simple economy in which you have production processes, some of them take long time, some of them take a shorter time, you have to integrate them, and that is the reason for the emergence of debt-credit relationships, even from a real economy point of view. So, I was wondering, because you have given us a fascinating picture of what happened, basically, of a fascinating picture of the process of financialization. So it seems that, considering that credit relationships are ultimately essential to the working also of the real economy, clearly at some point something went wrong. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about when exactly and what exactly went wrong. And secondly, I have another question actually. You have a very interesting remark, a set of remarks really, about the nation state and the weakening of the nation state once state finance becomes dependent on basically on international capital markets. And you said at some point that as a result of that, we are in a situation in which, of course, the state needs to cover interest payments, and that interest payments are covered by the budget, actually, by the annual budget. And I just wonder if you have in mind something else that could meet, from a more physiological point of view, the financial needs of the state. And finally, I think it's basically connected with this. What is your view of globalization?
Right. I don't know whether I'll be able to provide answers or explanations. As much as I understand, you know, the credit relationship, is it that, I'm asking you, is it that, you know, that's something of the past, the physical relation, you know, the relational banking, as they used to say in the olden days, whether that still prevail, you know, with this managerial, the kind of new forms of transactions, whether it prevails in fact. In the context of the Basel norms, a lot of people raise this question, that, you know, this will completely change the proximity and
the proximity of the financial sector vis-à-vis the real economy.
Yes. And also, no, in terms of credit relations, you know, the borrower and the lender, And you see, the borrower, in the case of the real economy, the lender can go and inspect what he is producing. But in the case of a financial borrower, you know, I just collect some money from a bank and I invest in immediately. Next morning I invest in something else. It cannot be traced where the money is moving. I take it to tax havens or do whatever. You know? So the relational banking, I think, has really been hit very badly. And that also is a very good point you are raising. I get it from from your question. I think possibly that means that the impact on the real sector will be minimal.
I see. Yeah.
That's a very good point.
And what about globalization?
Yes. Financial needs of the state.
Yeah, this is first.
Financial need of the state today, yes.
And yeah, two more questions. One it was on the financial need of the state, and the final one on globalization.
Globalization, yes. Financial need of the state is, of course, to number one, there is need, but the needs are not prior. Financial needs also relate to social subsidies. It relates to investment, capital expenditure, but those needs, even under democracy, even though there is a demand for these things, the state is not considering it. The state will rather minimize the deficit and then borrow to fill up that deficit, and that in turn will have a vicious impact. That will hit further, reduce further the social sector expenditure and the capital.
But how would you think that in a less pathological situation the state should finance its needs? Through taxation, what do you have in mind?
Yes, it should finance through taxation.
Many
yes, yeah, of course. Well, part of it, I mean, it cannot do it, it cannot implement because a lot of people don't pay taxes. And also the direct tax rate, it does not increase. Corporate taxes are very low. Corporate and personal income taxes. It's not, that's very, they don't want to be so unpopular. And globalization has opened the market. Market opening is another name of globalization. But
so you basically take overall a negative view of globalization. Yeah. So you think that you tend to privilege a gradual expansion of markets, providing much greater scope to domestic market and then perhaps gradual opening.
Not to the neglect of people within the country and the market within the country. And if needed, I don't support Trump, but what he's saying sometimes, it makes that kind of sense. That let me see, what is inside. But it's not tenable in this world, in today's world.
Yes, I think you have two questions. Well, you didn't ask, so you can ask. Yeah.
In a more hypothetical world, where finance, India's economy wasn't as dependent on the service sector and the finance wasn't as volatile, what kind of policies would you suggest to the government? Like, what if it were to correct, to make up for this and to sort of increase the real sector growth? How would you suggest that what kind of policy would you suggest the government?
I think the priority should go to capital expenditure. More of expansion. Agriculture should be should get more funds from the state. A lot of things which for an individual poor farmer it's impossible. So on the whole, his standard of living depends entirely. His living depends on what he produces. So capital expenditure, both especially in agriculture, and then infrastructure and social welfare, these things are very much needed. But at the same time, expansionary policies are needed, badly needed. The demand-led policies. Here, what is happening by opening up the market, they feel that it is going to bring in efficiency. It's some kind of a supply-side argument. So, there has to be some alternate policies like demand generating policies, and more expansion, more employment. That kind of
Yes, you had something.
It's just because it's a time ago and I read a paper that compared like this open market and capitalist societies that's in a way opening up for like a new kind of imperialism. You know, like you have like developing countries, and you like and then you force them to kind of open their markets. I mean, that's sometimes what the IMF did. Like, okay, we give you money, but then we want from you to kind of open your markets up to like new companies, and then it's kind of, you know, like it's not possible for locals to compete with them. So like you have a flooding in of huge businesses, like I don't know, huge American companies, who in a way, you know, raise their profits and like occupy the markets, and then it's like dangerous because whenever they feel to, you know, whenever they want, they can just like go, you know, and it's enough, and then you leave like again a country like you know, as in a way before. So it's just like yeah, it was just like an interesting you know, like thought, because it's kind of in a way like a new way of imperialistic behavior.
Yeah, this is something like, you know, what is imperialism after all? It's a game of power, in unequal power relations. So here, who has the power? You know, big capital, finance, and they can control policies across countries. So that's it. That's the new form of imperialism, which we try to do a little bit in our new book, changing face of imperialism.
And the critical word is controlling policies across countries.
Correct.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I hope you can join me in thanking the wonderful talk by
Thank you all. It's a wonderful session for me. I learned a lot.